When I was doing research for my Rotten Tomatoes video, I came across an article that, well, the article itself isn't that important, but at the end there was a sentence that really grabbed my attention. If it's critics versus marketing, who's winning the war of the tastemakers? Now that word, tastemakers, it's not the first time I'd heard it, but it was the first time I've really stopped to think about it. I asked myself, what does it mean to make taste? If you watched my previous video on defining taste, then you've heard me describe taste as a series of relative judgments unique to the individuals making the judgments. Much like its namesake, the literal sense of taste, there might be some commonalities. Lots of people like chocolate, for example, but no two senses of taste are exactly the same. To make taste in that context seems almost unthinkable. I mean, let's be clear, we're not just talking about setting trends here, influencing what kinds of things people are exposed to. We're talking about changing the way people react to things, changing how things taste to them. And if there's a war between tastemakers, what does that make the people who hold those tastes? Do they get any say in the matter? Or are they just territory to be occupied, a resource to be gathered and assimilated into some kind of collective?
Resistance is futile. We wish to improve ourselves. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service ours.
Impossible. My culture is based on freedom and self-determination.
Freedom is irrelevant. Self-determination is irrelevant. You must comply.
Another question we can ask is, what is the motive of these tastemakers? Well, to borrow an example from the article, of course, big film studios and other parts of the art industries will have a financial interest in drawing consumers to their products. Likewise, art collectors who purchase art primarily as a financial asset will have an interest in ensuring that these assets retain their value. But what about the other side of this so-called war? The critics, or more broadly, anyone else who doesn't have a direct stake in how the work is perceived. There's likely a cocktail of reasons, but to be honest, I'm less interested in speculating on the motives of these tastemakers than I am in exploring their methods. In my Rotten Tomatoes video, I pointed out what I saw as a contradiction between two relatively mainstream ideas about art. The first is the idea of the lowest common denominator, the idea that a lot of popular art is designed to maximize appeal at the expense of quality, and that this is a negative trait that results in low-quality popular works. The other idea is that of consensus, that there is profound wisdom in the collective views of the majority. In one case, what the majority thinks is bad and should be ignored. In another, what the majority thinks is good and should be the de facto last word on the matter. One explanation I've seen for this contradiction is that when consensus is invoked, it's often referring to critics and commentators, while lowest common denominator pretty much always refers to the general public, and because these are two different groups, there is no real inconsistency. This explanation relies on the idea that the consensus argument is an appeal to authority, rather than an appeal to majority. But if it really is an appeal to authority, wouldn't that mean that we should be listening to the opinions of only the most credentialed and authoritative critics? Find the critics on Rotten Tomatoes with advanced degrees in film studies and multiple decades of experience, and listen only to them? But that's never the argument that's made. The argument is always that we should heed the majority opinion, the consensus, even if that majority these days will largely consist of young, freelance bloggers with no formal education or experience in the industry they cover. So, I don't really buy that this is an appeal to authority. The core logical proposition being made is still that we should accept a premise simply because of the number of people proposing it. Personally, I've got a different idea of why these arguments continue to be made in tandem despite their apparent incompatibility, and that is because they serve separate functions. In the war of the tastemakers, lowest common denominator is a sword, an offensive weapon used to cut down opinions a tastemaker doesn't like. It tapers to a point, as if to concentrate blame for widely held views down to an individual target. That friend who listens to top 40 radio, it's their fault that pop music is so bad. They're complicit and perpetuating a system that promotes low-quality music at the expense of more talented and deserving artists. If only they had better taste, they could make better listening choices and stop enabling this unfair system. In contrast, consensus is a shield used to defend the tastemaker from receiving the same scrutiny they would give to others. It deflects blame from themselves as individuals, diffusing it instead across an entire group. Hey, don't look at me. I'm not the only one who thinks this way. I have the consensus on my side. In this respect, asking a tastemaker if they see a contradiction between these two arguments is like asking someone if they see a contradiction between their sword and shield. The answer is, of course not. In fact, they complement each other quite nicely. This basic setup of imposing negative consequences for holding certain opinions, then granting immunity from these consequences, or even providing benefits for holding others, this is what I consider to be the fundamental strategy of tastemaking. The 1-2 punch of lowest common denominator and consensus is but one of the many forms this strategy can take, and I plan on talking about some of the others in future videos. But for now, I want to make it clear that I'm not trying to say that individual tastes are like some kind of endangered species, to be sheltered and protected at all costs, that we should avoid sharing opinions or discussing art with others out of fear that we might influence someone else's tastes. In fact, the ability to receive new insight and to change one's value system in response to this insight is at the heart of the observational approach to art that I've been talking about since the very first video on this channel. So having said that, what is the difference between sharing and taste-making? Well, I like to think of a healthy marketplace of ideas as similar to a healthy ecosystem. A certain amount of genetic exchange is needed to maintain the health of the populations involved. In this analogy, that's akin to sharing ideas, then taking the best parts of the ideas we hear, leaving the bad, and remixing them, changing the old and new ideas to accommodate each other. But that is not what tastemaking is all about. Tastemaking is something more like a virus. Instead of healthy genetic exchange, its goal is to supplant the individuality of the host completely, to hijack the host's infrastructure in order to manufacture exact copies of itself. It comes in the form of ideas that lack the sophistication or nuance that would allow people to accept individual parts separately from the whole, and to modify these parts, to combine them with their own ideas to produce new results. Lowest common denominator and consensus are crude, simplistic memes that cannot be partially incorporated into existing tastes. Rather, they all but demand for tastes to be adopted wholesale, without modification. The ultimate result looks less like a healthy and diverse ecosystem of ideas, and more like the imposition of an intellectual monoculture. And intellectual monocultures have the same weaknesses as biological monocultures. They are stagnant, unable to evolve or innovate, and unable to adapt in the face of new challenges.
You must be aware that I am programmed to evolve, to better myself.
We too are on a quest to better ourselves, evolving toward a state of perfection.
Forgive me, but the Borg do not evolve. They conquer.
By assimilating other beings into our collective, we are bringing them closer to perfection.
Somehow, I question your motives.
Like the Borg Queen here, a tastemaker might think that they're acting as the guiding hand that steers culture to a more perfect state, but they're really accomplishing the opposite. That's why, rather than taking sides in the war of the tastemakers, I believe it is crucial to instead denounce the war and the parties fighting it, and to emphasize that tastes ought to be shared, not made, and that they should be based on ideas and experiences, not incentives and conditioning.